In this video, I'm building a faux stone fogger enclosure out of a couple of $10 plastic storage totes, a few plastic skulls, a little bit of lumber, and a handful of PVC parts and pieces. A while back, I watched a video on how to make heavy fog without needing any cooling by using an ultrasonic mister. If you haven't seen one of these setups before, the idea is to route the fog from a fog machine into a chamber that has high humidity created by the mister. When the fog mixes with the moist air, it gets heavier and stays closer to the ground. I think it's a brilliant concept, and I've added a link in the description to the video that inspired me if you want to check it out. Once I was clear on how this all functioned, I turned my attention to building a decorative enclosure for the whole thing. My basic concept centers around using two inexpensive plastic totes for the core structure. One tote will remain intact and the other one will be cut into two pieces. The intact tote will be placed upside down on the ground. The cut bottom of the other tote will be used as a water reservoir for the mister and placed inside. Then, the other portion of the cut tote will be slid on top to create a fairly seamless design that protects and seals the fog machine on top. The misting chamber will have some vent holes cut into it to allow the fog to seep out low to the ground without being able to climb up into the fogger chamber. Of course, I want to do better than just having a couple of plain plastic totes sitting in the front yard, so I decided to add a little more detail with a thicker top, supports on all the corners, and some paint to make it look like a stone altar or sarcophagus. And why not throw in a little extra spook with some skull details? On one of the plastic totes, I marked 4 inches up from the bottom all the way around. I then cut the bottom of the tote off at the marked line with my multi-tool, but I think some strong scissors or a utility knife would have been fine to use. I then roughly assembled the totes so I could figure out placement for my fogger. I just used some scrap pieces of wood as a platform and marked what I thought was a good location for the PVC pipe inlet to let the fog flow down into the misting chamber. Once the inlet position was marked, I used my jigsaw to cut out the hole. Purely for aesthetics, I wanted to try and camouflage the very obvious plastic support structures on the lip of the totes. So I covered any holes in the lip of both totes with painter's tape and filled the voids with spray foam insulation. While the foam finished expanding and drying, I moved on to building the lid. I wanted the lid to have a little weight to it so it looked more like an altar or sarcophagus with a heavy stone top. I figured I could get the look I wanted by building it up with some pressure-treated lumber. I started by cutting 3.5-inch squares from a pressure-treated 2x4. My plan was to double those up and round them off so the corners of the wooden top would match the rounded corners of the tote's plastic lid. But to make things easier on myself, I wanted to use a 2x4 for the sides of the lids without having to rip it to width. In order to do that, I needed just a little more height on the corner blocks, which I ended up getting from a piece of 1/2-inch fence picket. Using the same stop I already had set up on my miter saw for the square 2x4 pieces, I cut 3.5-inch square pieces from a pressure-treated fence picket. Again, trying to make things a little easier on myself, I decided to cut the radius on all individual square pieces first, and then glue them together. I started by marking and cutting the radius I wanted on one piece of picket. I then used that piece as a template to mark and cut the same radius on the rest of the square pieces of picket and 2x4. Once I had the rough radius cut on all the pieces, I glued them together, added a few nails to hold the pieces in place, clamped them tight, and set them aside to dry. Once the glue had finally dried, I sanded the curved sides smooth so it looked more like a solid piece. Now that the corner pieces were finished, I cut the 2x4 pieces that will be the long side of the top and test fit them on the plastic lid to be sure everything fit as expected. Once the long sides were good, I cut 2x4 pieces for the short sides as well. To assemble what I'm calling the lid frame, I drilled pocket holes in each end of the 2x4 side pieces and attached them with some glue and pocket screws to the corner blocks. This ended up being a little tricky because the rounded corner pieces kept wanting to roll away from the pocket screws. Because the Tote's plastic lid had some raised detail, I decided to cut some 2-inch strips from another fence picket to use as a platform around the edge of the lid, which I'm just going to refer to as the lid base. It helped raise everything so those protruding details wouldn't get in the way during assembly. I made the strips wide enough to have a 1/2-inch overhang for a little extra detail and to help hide any gap that may show between the plastic lid and the wooden lid. I cut them the length based on the lid dimensions, glued, and clamped them in place. Once the glue had a chance to dry, using the same template piece I used for the corner blocks, I traced and cut a radius on the corners of the lid frame and sanded the whole thing smooth. For the top covering of the wooden lid, I used even more fence pickets. I cut pieces to length so they fit over the top opening of the lid frame, leaving the same amount of frame exposed on all sides. Using the corner block template again, I added the radius on the end picket pieces so they matched the rest of the corner pieces. Now that I had all the elements for the wooden top, I just needed to assemble them. I started by gluing the lid frame to the lid base and clamped them together to dry. After the glue had a chance to dry, I started installing the top picket pieces. I took a really basic approach to this and just glued and nailed them in place next to each other one at a time. I did have some small warping of the picket boards to deal with, but it wasn't too hard to overcome with some clamps and some extra nails. Once I had the end pieces installed, I just glued, clamped, and nailed each successive board in the same way. Once all the top boards were installed, I just did a quick sanding to help smooth them out for painting later. Now that the lid was assembled, I had a few more things to do to finish up the totes. To clean up the spray foam, I used my multi-tool to cut the foam so it roughly matched the existing shape of the tote. I really wasn't hoping for a lot here. I was just trying to fill the voids so it looked a little more like a solid piece. For the fogger port, I put some sealing foam strip around the hole, hoping that it would keep the fog from leaking out. I then used a few 90-degree connectors, a coupling, and some random sections of 1.5-inch PVC pipe for routing the fog down into the mister chamber. I figured the combination of PVC pieces here would kind of clamp itself to the tote and hold itself in place during use, but still allow me to take it apart for cleaning and storage. As you can see, I cut a longer piece of PVC pipe that runs horizontal inside the tote. Later, I decided the extra weight was causing too much deformation of the tote, so I took it out and just left the elbows. For the reservoir, I wanted to keep the fog from sneaking out of any gaps in the tote, so it would be forced to leave through the vents. To do this, I wrapped the edges of the reservoir with some pre-split pipe insulation, so it would seal tightly against the containing tote. It actually ended up being really snug and did exactly what I needed it to do. Later on, I ended up hot gluing the pipe insulation in place to help keep it from falling off during assembly and disassembly of the enclosure. For some extra detail, I wanted the fog to spill out of the mouths of some plastic skulls I had found at home, which are actually the same skulls I used on my cemetery fence. In order to connect them to the tote properly, I drew a vertical line around the skull, making sure to keep the jaw mechanism intact. I cut the skull in half with a utility knife and made some fine adjustments with scissors so the backside of the skull would sit flat and flush against the tote. The plastic skulls were pretty flimsy, and I needed more solid material to properly glue these to the tote, so I filled the half skulls with some spray foam. After the spray foam finished expanding and drying, I cut it flush with the back of the skull using a hacksaw blade. Unfortunately, my fog machine stuck up too high to leave the plastic tote lid intact, so I had to cut the middle of the lid out for it to fit properly. The side benefit here is that cutting the plastic lid allows more air into the fogger area. Since I'm relying on the Venturi effect to force the fog down in the misting chamber, I need as much air volume around the fog machine and the PVC port as I can get. While I was cutting things, I decided to go ahead with adding the vents in the misting chamber for the fog to spill out of. I measured to the center point of the two short sides and one of the long sides. I marked the point where it would be just above the water reservoir and drilled a 1 1/4 inch hole. That placed the vent holes at the lowest point the fog can spill from. I left one long side without a vent because that'll be the back of the enclosure where I planned to run the electrical cords and didn't want the fog heading that way anyways. Conveniently, the position of the vents makes it so the half skulls will sit with their mouths over the vent hole and the tops of their head at a position to help hold the top tote in place. After marking where the top tote will sit, I use construction adhesive to glue the half skulls over the vent holes, with the top of the skull sitting just at that traced line. After the glued skulls dried, I marked the location for the PVC corner posts on the bottom and top tote lids, removed the spray foam, filled the area with construction adhesive, and put the PVC coupling in place. I repeated this process for all 4 corners. The plan was to have a PVC coupling on the bottom, the top, and a decorative skull coupling in the center. To make the center coupling, I found these mini skulls, again at home, that worked perfectly. I traced the coupling on the bottom of the skull and cut the hole open in multiple directions so I could just fold the plastic back. I didn't want to remove the plastic entirely because it gave me more material to use for gluing the coupling and the skull together. But before gluing, I temporarily positioned the coupling in the skull and used it as a guide to drill a hole out the top of the skull. After the holes were drilled, I hot glued the coupling in place. To help keep everything aligned, I used a scrap piece of PVC pipe to help line the coupling and the holes up while the glue set up. Then I went back and filled any gaps with more hot glue. Now that all the couplings were in place, I cut 8 pieces of PVC pipe to length, 2 for each corner. I put 1 piece of pipe in the bottom of the skull coupling, 1 piece in the top, and slid them into the lid couplings. These columns add a little decoration and help support the extra weight of the wooden lid and anything else I might decide to put on top of it later. I still needed a way to run all the electrical. I drilled a single hole out of the upper part of the backside, just like I did for the fog vents in the misting chamber. This hole is for any of the power cords to run out of the enclosure to be plugged in. Ultimately, I decided to use a power strip mounted to the inside of the wooden lid for the mister and the fog machine to plug into. That way I only had one external cord to deal with. I ran a quick test to make sure everything functioned properly, and then it was all ready for paint. Since the tinted Drylock worked so well for my cemetery columns, I decided to try it on the totes. I wasn't super confident that this was going to stick to the plastic, but it actually worked pretty well. I started using a paint roller, but that was an immediate fail, so I switched to just putting a messy coating on everything with a paintbrush. It was going on a lot thinner than I expected, and it was taking a lot longer to do, so I ended up outside putting on several more coats into the night. It looked pretty good to my tired eyes, but I ended up having to touch it up in some places the next day. And just like I did with the cemetery columns, I added a little bit of aging with a watery black paint wash. I just wiped it on and let it settle in the cracks and divots. Surprisingly, the spray foam took the paint better than expected, and with the black wash on it, it looked like worn down or broken off stone. After the paint was all dry, it was ready to go. I took a quick video of how the whole thing gets assembled before moving it out to the front yard. I started by laying the quote-unquote bottom lid down first and placed the insulated reservoir on top of it with the Ultrasonic Mister inside of it. Obviously, before actual use, I'd filled this reservoir with water. Then I slid the bottom tote over the reservoir and secured it to the bottom lid to create a sealed misting chamber. Okay, so I got a little aggressive with this earlier and ended up knocking one of the corner posts off, but it was easy to reattach with some more construction adhesive later. Next, I slid the top tote in place, connected up the corner posts, and made sure the painted lines matched so no bare plastic was visible. Then I just tossed in the scrap boards for a platform, lined up the fogger with the PVC pipes, and finished up with the wooden lid. One thing I should mention is that I decided to run the power cord for the mister up through the PVC port in order to plug everything into the power strip. I figured it was best to avoid putting any more holes in the tote if possible. And there you have it. an inexpensive misting fogger enclosure that hides and protects the fog machine and fits nicely into my front yard cemetery scene. With a total cost of about $50 and only a weekend's worth of work, I think it would be hard for me to come up with a better design. I love how the fog comes out of the skull's mouths and moves nicely along the ground. And like all the other Halloween decorations I make, designing it to be disassembled for storage is a huge plus for me. So now I guess the only thing left to do is to figure out what to make to go on top of it for next Halloween.